There is a secret I've carried for 17 years. A secret so painful, so contradictory to everything I've publicly taught about faith that I've hidden it even from myself. My name is Antonia Salzano. I am 54 years old, and I am the mother of Blessed Carlo Acutis. For nearly 2 decades, I've traveled to 50 countries, speaking to millions of people about God's constant presence, about answered prayers, about divine providence that never fails. I've written books about trusting God in suffering. I've consoled thousands of grieving mothers with words about God's faithfulness, but I've been lying. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but lying nonetheless. Because the truth I've never confessed publicly until now, is that during the most critical 3 months of my life, when my 15-year-old son Carlo was dying of fulminant leukemia, God was completely, absolutely, devastatingly silent. For 90 consecutive days, from July to October 2006, I prayed desperately for my son's healing. I organized novenas involving thousands of people. I made pilgrimages to shrines. I fasted. I bargained. I begged. I pleaded with God in ways that would break your heart if you heard them. And God said nothing. Not a whisper of consolation. Not a sign of hope. Not even the grace to accept what was happening. Just silence. Complete, crushing, abandoning silence while my beautiful boy wasted away before my eyes. What happened in the early morning hours of December 12th, 2023, the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe, when Carlo visited me to reveal the 3 reasons why God sometimes remains in absolute silence during our moments of greatest desperation, was one of the most painful and transformative experiences of my spiritual life. The truth Carlo revealed to me about divine silence forced me to confront a reality about God's plans that I had been denying for 17 years since his death. This is not a comfortable story. This is not a story about easy faith or quick answers. This is a story about what happens when God refuses to speak, when heaven seems locked, when your most desperate prayers echo back unanswered. And it's a story about why, according to my son who now sees from the other side, God's silence is sometimes the greatest gift he can give us, even though it feels like the cruelest abandonment. Before I tell you what Carlo revealed, I need you to understand the depth of my hypocrisy. For 17 years, I stood on stages around the world, dried the tears of grieving mothers, and assured them that God hears every prayer. I told them that silence doesn't mean absence, that darkness doesn't mean abandonment. I spoke with authority and conviction, and people believed me because I was Carlo Acutis' mother, the woman whose son died a saint. But inside, I was a fraud. Inside, I carried a wound of divine abandonment that never healed. Inside, I questioned whether God really listens to prayers or whether we're just talking to ourselves, creating meaning out of randomness to make suffering bearable. That contradiction finally exploded on December 10th, 2023, in Barcelona, Spain, during a conference on suffering and hope. And what followed, Carlo's visit 2 days later, changed everything I thought I understood about faith, prayer, and the mysterious ways God works in human lives. This is my confession. This is my testimony. And this is the truth about divine silence that will either shatter your faith or forge it into something unbreakable. Let me take you back to July 2006. Carlo was 15 years old, vibrant, full of life. He had just finished his school year with excellent grades. He was working on expanding his website about Eucharistic miracles, teaching himself new programming languages. He played soccer with friends, attended daily mass, spent hours at his computer, lived the life of a normal Italian teenager who happened to have an extraordinary relationship with God. On July 18th, 2006, Carlo complained of a headache. Nothing dramatic, just a persistent ache that wouldn't go away with typical pain medication. Being a typical mother, I assumed it was eye strain from too many hours at the computer. I scheduled an appointment with his optometrist for the following week. By July 22nd, the headaches had intensified. Carlo started experiencing fatigue, unusual for a boy who normally had boundless energy. On July 25th, he developed a fever that spiked to 39 degrees Celsius. We took him to our family doctor, who ran basic blood tests. The call came on July 27th at 3:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was in my office, working on a publishing project when the phone rang. Our doctor's voice was strained, careful. Signora Salzano, Carlo's blood work shows some concerning abnormalities. I need you to take him to the hospital immediately for more comprehensive testing. What kind of abnormalities? His white blood cell count is extremely elevated. It could be an infection, but we need to rule out other possibilities. Other possibilities. That's how doctors speak when they suspect something terrible but don't want to say it directly. We went to the hospital that evening. More blood tests. A bone marrow biopsy scheduled for the next day. My husband Andrea and I sat in the waiting room, holding hands, trying not to think the worst. Carlo, meanwhile, remained remarkably calm. He brought a book about Eucharistic miracles and read it while we waited for test results. On July 29th, the oncologist delivered the diagnosis: acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Aggressive, fast-moving. Treatment would need to begin immediately. The doctor spoke in percentages and statistics, in treatment protocols and survival rates, in carefully neutral language designed to give us information without giving us hope or despair. I remember asking, "What are his chances?" The doctor hesitated. "Signora Salzano, every case is different. We'll do everything we can." That's when I started praying, really praying. Not the comfortable, routine prayers I'd said my whole life, but desperate, clawing, begging prayers. That night, I stayed awake until 4 a.m. on my knees in our home chapel, pleading with God to heal my son. God said nothing. Over the following days, Carlo began chemotherapy. The treatment was brutal. Violent nausea, hair loss, weakness so profound he could barely stand. My vibrant, energetic son became a pale shadow. But through it all, he maintained an inexplicable peace. While I was falling apart, Carlo was serene. "Mama," he told me one evening in early August, "don't be afraid. Whatever happens is God's will, and God's will is always good." How could he say that? How could a 15-year-old facing death be more spiritually mature than his mother? I smiled and nodded, but inside I was screaming at God, "How is this good? How is destroying my son part of any loving plan?" I organized prayer chains. I contacted every religious community I knew, asking them to pray for Carlo's healing. I arranged a pilgrimage to Lourdes in mid-August, bringing water from the grotto back to bless Carlo. I collected relics of saints, pieces of cloth that had touched their bodies, drops of their blood, and placed them around Carlo's hospital room. God remained silent. By September, the doctors were cautiously optimistic. The chemotherapy seemed to be working. Carlo's white blood cell counts were improving. There was talk of remission, of returning to normal life. I allowed myself to hope. On September 28th, everything collapsed. Carlo developed a sudden high fever. New blood tests revealed that the leukemia had returned with devastating speed. The doctors used words like relapse and aggressive recurrence and extremely serious. That night, I broke, completely broke. I went into our home chapel and screamed at God, literally screamed. I demanded to know why he was doing this. I asked what I had done wrong, what sin I was being punished for. I offered my own life in exchange for Carlo's. I made promises about how we would dedicate his life to God's service if he would only spare him. The silence was deafening. October arrived, and with it, the slow realization that Carlo was dying. The doctors stopped talking about treatment and started talking about comfort. Hospice was mentioned. My 15-year-old son was receiving palliative care. I prayed harder. I organized a 24-hour prayer vigil at our parish, with people taking shifts to pray around the clock for Carlo's healing. I contacted important church figures asking them to intercede. I even wrote a letter to Pope Benedict XVI, begging for his prayers. God said nothing. On October 10th, Carlo was admitted to San Gerardo Hospital in Monza. The doctors said he had days, maybe a week at most. I spent every moment at his bedside, holding his hand, whispering prayers, begging God to perform a miracle. And here's what tormented me most. Carlo didn't need my faith. He had his own, and it was stronger than mine. While I was desperately negotiating with God, Carlo was peacefully accepting whatever came. While I was drowning in despair, he was floating in grace. The person who should have been most afraid was the calmest person in the room. "Mama," he told me on October 11th, the day before he died, "I'm happy to die because I've lived my life without wasting even a minute on things that don't please God." happy to die. My 15-year-old son was happy to die. And I was angry at God for not stopping it. Carlo died on October 12, 2006 at 6:45 a.m. He went peacefully, his last breath barely distinguishable from his previous ones. And in that moment, I felt something break inside me that I wasn't sure would ever heal. God had been silent for 90 days. 90 days of desperate prayer, and not one word of comfort, not one sign of presence, not one moment of consolation. Just silence. Abandoning, devastating silence. After Carlo died, something strange happened. People started calling him a saint almost immediately. Stories circulated about his holiness, his devotion to the Eucharist, his computer projects documenting Eucharistic miracles. The local bishop opened a cause for his beatification. Suddenly, I wasn't just a grieving mother. I was the mother of a potential saint, and with that role came expectations. People wanted to hear about God's faithfulness. They wanted to know how I survived losing Carlo. They wanted reassurance that God had a plan, that suffering had meaning, that prayer worked. So I gave them what they wanted. I crafted a narrative about trusting God even when we don't understand, about divine providence working in mysterious ways, about how Carlo's death was part of a larger plan to inspire young people around the world. And it wasn't entirely false. Carlo's story did inspire people. His beatification process did progress. Young people did find faith through his example. But underneath my public testimony was a private wound that never healed. The memory of God's silence during those 90 days when I needed him most. I became very good at compartmentalizing. In public, I was Antonia Salzano, faithful mother of Blessed Carlo Acutis, witness to God's mysterious but loving providence. In private, especially late at night when I couldn't sleep, I was just a woman who felt abandoned by God when her son was dying. The years passed. 2007, 2008, 2009. I traveled extensively, speaking at conferences and retreats. I wrote articles about Carlo's life and spirituality. I cooperated with the Vatican investigation for his beatification. My public ministry grew, even as my private doubt festered. In 2010, I was invited to speak at a conference for bereaved parents in the United States. About 200 mothers and fathers attended, people who had lost children to accidents, illnesses, violence. They looked at me with such hope, such desperate need for meaning in their grief. I told them about Carlo's peaceful death, about his final words, about how his story was bringing people to faith. I told them that God wastes nothing, that every tear has purpose, that their children's lives mattered eternally. A woman approached me afterward, tears streaming down her face. "How did you do it?" she asked. "How did you keep your faith when God took your son?" I gave her the answer I'd rehearsed 100 times. God didn't take Carlo from me. He transformed Carlo's presence. Now, instead of one son in one house, I have millions of spiritual children around the world. She hugged me, thanking me for giving her hope. And I felt like a hypocrite. By 2015, Carlo's cause for beatification was advancing rapidly. Medical experts were examining an alleged miracle attributed to his intercession. A Brazilian boy with a severe pancreatic disease who had been healed after his mother prayed to Carlo. The evidence was compelling. The Vatican was taking it seriously. I should have been joyful. Instead, I felt conflicted. If Carlo was truly a saint, if God was truly working miracles through his intercession, why had God been silent during those 90 days when I begged for Carlo's healing? Why did God answer prayers for strangers but not for his own mother? I never voiced these questions publicly. I buried them deep, covered them with layers of acceptable theology and spiritual platitudes. But they were always there, festering like an infected wound that never quite healed. On October 10th, 2020, Carlo was beatified in Assisi. It was a glorious ceremony. Thousands of young people attending, Cardinal Agostino Vallini presiding, Carlo's incorrupt body displayed for veneration. Everyone around me was experiencing joy, wonder, gratitude. I felt numb. Grateful, yes, but also confused. This was supposed to be the vindication of my faith, the proof that Carlo's death had meaning. So why did I still feel that God had abandoned me 14 years earlier? After the beatification, The requests for my testimony intensified. Everyone wanted to hear from Blessed Carlo's mother. I gave hundreds of interviews, wrote multiple articles, appeared in documentaries. Always the same message: trust God, embrace suffering, believe in divine providence. And always underneath, the same private question: how can I teach trust in a God who refused to speak when I needed him most? By 2023, I was exhausted. 17 years of maintaining this double life, public faith and private doubt, had drained me. I had spoken to millions of people about God's faithfulness while carrying a wound of perceived abandonment that never healed. And if this channel has been an answer for you, consider leaving a super thanks. This financial help, however small it may seem, sustains this mission and allows us to continue bringing deep and transformative content to more lives that need this word. In early December 2023, I was invited to speak at a conference in Barcelona on finding hope in suffering. The irony wasn't lost on me. I would be teaching about finding hope while privately questioning whether hope was anything more than a psychological coping mechanism. The conference took place December 9th or 10th at a large Catholic center in Barcelona. About 800 people attended, mostly families who had experienced significant loss: death of children, terminal illnesses, tragic accidents. They looked at me with such expectation, such need for answers I wasn't sure I had. I gave my usual talk: Carlo's story, his holiness, his peaceful death, his intercession, God's mysterious plan, trust, hope, faith. All the words I'd said 1,000 times before. During the Q&A session on December 10th, a woman stood up. She was probably in her early 40s, thin, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of months of grief and sleepless nights. "Señora Antonia," she said, her voice shaking, "my name is Marta Rodriguez. My 8-year-old son Pablo died of leukemia 6 months ago. I prayed every single day for 6 months for his healing. I organized prayer groups. I made pilgrimages. I did everything you're supposed to do when you trust God." She paused, tears streaming down her face. And God never answered. Not once. Complete silence. So my question is, did you really feel that God heard your prayers during Carlo's illness? Because I prayed for 6 months and felt nothing but emptiness. The conference hall went completely silent. 800 people waiting for my answer. Waiting for the mother of Blessed Carlo Acutis to explain how prayer works, how God responds, how faith survives unanswered prayers. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. This woman had asked the one question I'd been running from for 17 years. She had exposed the wound I'd hidden from everyone, including myself. I could have given my rehearsed answer. I could have talked about God's mysterious ways, about prayers being answered differently than we expect, about how suffering builds character. I could have maintained the facade. Instead, I heard myself say, "Yes, Marta. I felt emptiness too." For 90 days, God was silent, completely silent, and I've never fully understood why. The moment the words left my mouth, I realized what I'd done. I'd just confessed, in front of 800 people and multiple cameras recording for later broadcast, that God had been silent during my greatest crisis. I'd just undermined 17 years of testimony about divine faithfulness. The conference organizers looked alarmed, the audience looked confused, and Marta Rodriguez looked relieved, as if my admission of doubt was somehow more helpful than all my polished testimony about faith. I finished answering questions, but I was on autopilot. That night, alone in my hotel room in Barcelona, I broke down completely. I had finally admitted the truth about God's silence, and instead of feeling liberated, I felt terrified. What if I was wrong about everything? What if all my ministry had been built on a lie? What if God really had abandoned me and everything I'd taught others about his faithfulness was just a story I'd told myself to cope with that abandonment? I fell asleep around 2 a.m., emotionally and spiritually exhausted. And that's when Carlo came. I woke suddenly at 4:12 a.m. on December the 12th, 2023, the feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe. The room was dark except for the soft glow from the streetlights outside my hotel window. And sitting in the chair beside my bed, as real and solid as any living person, was Carlo. He was wearing the Rumo a Santidade t-shirt he'd loved so much. Toward holiness in Portuguese. his characteristic sneakers, his warm smile. But his expression was more serious than I usually saw it, as if he'd come for a difficult but necessary conversation. "Mama," he said, his voice exactly as I remembered it. "It's time. You've been carrying this wound for 17 years, and it's been poisoning everything you're trying to do. Tonight, I'm going to explain why God was silent during my illness. And I need you to listen carefully because it's going to hurt." I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. "Carlo, is this real? Are you really here?" "I'm as real as I need to be for this conversation, Mama. And yes, heaven has sent me specifically to have this talk with you tonight. What you said today in your conference, admitting God's silence, that was the first step. Now I need to explain why that silence happened and what it means. I've wanted to understand for so long. I know you have. And the fact that you've wanted to understand while simultaneously being angry about it is part of what makes this so painful." Carlo leaned forward in his chair. "Mama, God has 3 specific reasons for remaining silent during our greatest suffering. 3 reasons that are all painful to accept, but all necessary to understand if you're going to continue this ministry authentically. Tell me, please." Carlo took a breath, which struck me as strange since he didn't technically need to breathe, and began. "The first reason God sometimes remains silent is this. Some prayers are so important, so consequential, that God cannot answer them immediately without destroying the greater purpose he has planned." "I don't understand." "Mama, your prayer for my healing was genuine, pure, and completely understandable. Any mother would have prayed the same prayer. But if God had answered that prayer, if he had healed me and I had lived to be 80 years old, millions of souls who found Jesus through my death would never have encountered him." I felt a sharp pain in my chest. "So God chose those millions of strangers over his own mother's plea?" "No, Mama. God chose what would bring the greatest glory to him and the greatest good to the greatest number of people. That's what love does. It chooses the greater good even when the immediate cost is devastating." Carlo's voice was gentle but firm. "Think about it. If I'd been healed, what would have happened? I would have been grateful, certainly. I would have continued going to daily Mass, working on my Eucharistic Miracles website, living a good Christian life. Maybe I would have become a programmer, gotten married, had children, died quietly at 80 years old, having impacted maybe a few hundred people who knew me personally. That sounds wonderful to me. Of course it does. But Mama, instead of that scenario, my death at 15 has led to millions of young people discovering the Eucharist. Thousands have entered religious life because of my example. Countless people have been healed through my intercession. My story has spread across the globe, transcending languages and cultures because a teenage boy who loved video games and computers also loved Jesus so much he was willing to die for him. Tears were streaming down my face. But why did God have to be silent about it? Why couldn't he at least comfort me, explain what he was doing? That's the second reason, Mama, and it's even harder to accept. Carlo stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Barcelona streets below. Some spiritual lessons can only be learned in complete darkness. If God had comforted you during my illness, if he had explained his plan, if he had given you consolation and peace, you would never have developed the faith muscles you needed for this ministry. What do you mean? Carlo turned back to face me. Mama, think about why people listen to you. It's not because you have all the answers. It's not because your faith is perfect. It's because your pain is authentic. When you speak to grieving mothers, they trust you because they can sense that you've been where they are. Your authority doesn't come from your polished words or your theological knowledge. It comes from the rawness of your genuine suffering. So God let me suffer to make me more effective. God let you suffer because that suffering forged you into a vessel capable of holding other people's pain. Mama, if you had experienced easy comfort during my illness, you would have become one of those speakers who gives nice platitudes that don't actually help anyone. Instead, you became someone who can sit with people in their darkness because you've been in that darkness yourself. I was sobbing now. It was so hard, Carlo, so unbearably hard. I know, Mama. I watched from heaven, and it broke my heart to see your suffering. But I also saw what was being forged in you, a capacity for empathy, a depth of faith, a willingness to continue trusting God even when he seemed absent. Those qualities aren't developed in comfort. They're only developed in the crucible of unanswered prayer. You said there were 3 reasons. What's the third? Carlo came and sat on the edge of my bed, taking my hand exactly as he used to do when he was alive. The third reason is the most painful of all, Mama. God sometimes remains silent because certain souls need to grow through the experience of apparent abandonment. Not every soul, only specific ones that God knows can handle it and will emerge stronger from it. That sounds cruel. Does it? Or does it sound like a loving father who trusts his child enough to let them walk through the dark forest alone because he knows they need to develop the strength that can only come from that lonely journey? Carlo squeezed my hand. Mama, during those 90 days of silence, something profound happened in your soul. You discovered that your faith wasn't dependent on feeling God's presence. You learned that love continues even when the beloved seems absent. You developed the kind of raw, desperate faith that can only exist in the dark night of the soul. But I felt abandoned. I felt like God didn't love me. And yet you kept praying. You kept going to Mass. You kept begging God for my healing even though he seemed deaf to your pleas. Don't you see? That's the purest form of faith, continuing to seek God even when he seems to have disappeared. That's the faith of Job, of Mother Teresa in her dark night, of Jesus on the cross crying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I was quiet for a long moment, processing everything Carlo had said. Finally, I whispered, "So all my suffering, all that silence, all that feeling of abandonment, it was intentional. God chose it?" "Yes, Mama, God chose it because he loved you enough to transform you from a comfortable believer into a crucible of faith capable of holding the grief of millions. He chose it because he knew you were strong enough to survive it and wise enough to eventually understand it. He chose it because he had a mission for you that required you to be forged in fire. How can I accept that? How can I accept that my suffering was part of God's plan?" Carlo smiled. That warm, knowing smile I'd missed so much. "You don't have to accept it all at once, Mama. But you do have to start being honest about it. No more pretending that God's silence didn't happen. No more giving people platitudes about answered prayer when you know the truth is more complicated. No more hiding your wound because you think showing it makes you a bad witness. People won't understand. They'll think I'm losing my faith. Some people won't understand, but the people who really need your message, the people drowning in God's silence right now, they will understand. They will finally feel seen and heard by someone who's been where they are." Carlo stood up, preparing to leave. "Mama, tomorrow you're going to receive an email from a woman in India. Her name is Priya Sharma. She lost 3 children in a bus accident. She's been contemplating suicide because she prayed for months for God to save them, and he didn't. When she reads about your experience of God's silence, it will save her life. That's why this conversation is happening now." "How will she read about it?" "Because you're going to start telling the truth, the whole truth. Not just the comfortable parts about God's faithfulness, but also the painful parts about his silence. You're going to teach people that God's silence isn't abandonment. It's a different kind of presence, a refining presence, a forging presence, a presence that hurts like fire but produces something stronger than what existed before. What if I'm not strong enough to do this?" Carlo touched my face gently, the way he used to when I was upset, and he wanted to comfort me. "Mama, you've been strong enough for 17 years. You survived my death. You survived God's silence. You survived the wound of feeling abandoned while simultaneously having to teach others about divine faithfulness. If you can survive all that, you can survive being honest about it. When will I see you again? Every time you tell the truth about suffering, I'm there. Every time you sit with someone in their darkness without trying to fix it, I'm there. Every time you admit that faith is messy and painful and doesn't always feel good, I'm there." He moved toward the window, his form beginning to fade slightly. "And Mama, one more thing. The woman you spoke to today, Marta Rodriguez, who asked about God's silence during her son's illness, call her tomorrow. Tell her everything I've told you tonight. She's going to become one of your most important partners in this new phase of your ministry." Like, what new phase? "The phase where you stop pretending and start being real. The phase where you stop giving people easy answers and start sitting with them in hard questions. The phase where you stop being the perfect witness and start being the wounded healer." Carlo's smile widened. That's the ministry that will actually change lives, Mama. Not the polished testimony, but the broken one that lets light shine through the cracks. And with that, he was gone. The room was dark again, silent again, empty again. But somehow it felt less empty than it had in 17 years. I lay awake for the rest of the night, processing everything Carlo had told me. The 3 reasons for divine silence. The painful truth that my suffering had been necessary for my mission. The call to start being honest about the messiness of faith instead of presenting a sanitized version. As dawn broke over Barcelona on December 12, 2023, I made a decision. I would stop lying to others and to myself. I would start telling the whole truth about God's silence, about unanswered prayers, about the dark night of the soul that forges authentic faith. It would be painful. It would be controversial. Some people would think I was losing my faith or undermining the gospel. But others, the ones drowning in God's silence right now, desperately needing someone to tell them they're not alone, they would finally feel seen. And that, I realized, was worth the cost. It's now March 15th, 2025, 3 months after Carlo's visit on December 12th. The last 90 days have been the most challenging and liberating of my entire ministry. On December 13th, 2023, the morning after Carlo appeared to me, I did 2 things. First, I called Marta Rodriguez, the woman who had asked about God's silence at the Barcelona conference. We spoke for 2 hours. I told her everything about the 90 days of God's silence during Carlo's illness, about my 17 years of hiding that wound, about Carlo's visit and his explanation of the 3 reasons for divine silence. Marta wept. Not tears of despair, but tears of relief. Thank you, she kept saying. Thank you for telling me the truth. Thank you for not giving me easy answers. Thank you for letting me know I'm not crazy for feeling abandoned. Second, I opened my laptop and wrote an article titled, "The 90 Days God Was Silent, a Confession from Carlo Acutis's Mother." In it, I detailed everything I've shared with you in this testimony. The prayers that seemed to bounce off heaven's ceiling, the bargaining and begging that produced no response, the wound of perceived abandonment that I'd carried for 17 years. I hesitated before publishing it. This confession would undermine my carefully constructed image as the faithful mother who'd gracefully accepted God's will. It would expose my doubt, my anger, my years of spiritual fraud. It might damage Carlo's reputation, make people question his holiness, harm the cause for his eventual canonization. But I remembered Carlo's words. No more hiding your wound because you think showing it makes you a bad witness. I published the article on December 15th, 2023. Within 24 hours, it had been translated into 15 languages and shared millions of times across social media. The response was overwhelming and split almost perfectly in half. Half the responses were negative. Some people accused me of losing my faith, of undermining Carlo's witness, of causing scandal. Conservative Catholic websites wrote articles criticizing my dangerous theology. Some people even suggested that perhaps I was never as faithful as I'd claimed, that my doubt proved I was unworthy to be the mother of a blessed. Those criticisms stung. But they didn't surprise me. I knew that admitting God's silence would be controversial in certain circles. The other half of responses, the half that mattered most, were from people drowning in their own experience of divine silence. Grieving parents who'd prayed desperately for children's healing and received no answer. Spouses of terminally ill partners who'd begged God for more time together. People suffering from chronic illness who'd asked for relief and encountered only silence. Thank you for telling the truth, they wrote. Thank you for admitting that God doesn't always answer. Thank you for showing that faith can coexist with feeling abandoned. On December 16th, exactly as Carlo had prophesied, I received an email from Priya Sharma in Mumbai, India. She had lost 3 children, ages 6, 9, and 11, in a bus accident 8 months earlier. She had been planning to commit suicide on December 15th, having lost all faith in a God who would allow such tragedy. But on December 15th, someone shared my article with her. She read about the 90 days of God's silence, about my wound of abandonment, about Carlo's explanation of why God sometimes remains silent during our greatest suffering, and something shifted in her. Signora Antonia, she wrote, your article saved my life. Not because it gave me easy answers, but because it told me the truth, that God's silence doesn't mean God's absence, that unanswered prayers don't mean unheard prayers, that the dark night of the soul is where faith is forged. I'm not okay yet, but I'm going to keep living and I'm going to trust that maybe, somehow, this darkness is part of a greater purpose I can't yet see. I wept when I read her email. This was why Carlo had appeared to me. This was why he'd pushed me to stop pretending and start being honest. Because the people who needed hope most weren't the ones who wanted pretty platitudes. They were the ones who needed someone to sit with them in the darkness and say, "I've been there too, and somehow we survive." Over the following weeks, I received thousands of similar messages. A man whose wife had died of cancer after years of prayer, a woman whose son was in prison despite decades of prayers for his conversion, a couple who'd suffered multiple miscarriages while everyone told them God would give them children when the time was right. All of them thanking me not for easy answers, but for honest questions. Not for theological explanations, but for authentic admission that faith is messy and God's ways are often painful and incomprehensible. In January 2025, Marta Rodriguez and I began collaborating on a new ministry, specifically for people experiencing divine silence. We called it the Ministry of the Dark Night, inspired by St. John of the Cross's writings about God's seeming absence during spiritual growth. We don't offer simple solutions or prosperity gospel promises. Instead, we offer honest companionship through the darkness. We share our stories of unanswered prayers, and we teach the 3 reasons Carlo gave me for divine silence. 1, some prayers are too important to be answered immediately because God has a greater purpose that would be destroyed by the quick fix we're asking for. 2, some spiritual lessons can only be learned in complete darkness, where feeling God's absence forces us to develop faith muscles we didn't know we needed. 3, some souls need to grow through apparent abandonment because that experience forges a depth of faith that can't be developed any other way. These aren't comfortable teachings. They don't make people feel better immediately, but they're true. And truth, even painful truth, is more healing than comfortable lies. In February 2025, I gave a talk in Rome at a conference for bereaved parents. Instead of my usual polished testimony about God's mysterious providence, I told the raw truth about the 90 days of silence. I confessed that I'd spent 17 years lying to myself and others about having perfect faith. I admitted that some days, even now, I'm angry at God for taking Carlo. The response was profound. Instead of the typical polite applause, there was a moment of stunned silence followed by dozens of people standing, many of them crying. Not crying because I'd given them hope, but crying because I'd given them permission to be honest about their own struggles with faith. After the talk, a priest approached me. He was in his 60s, a professor of theology at a prominent seminary. "Signora Antonia," he said, "I need to confess something. I've taught theology for 30 years, and I've always presented faith as if it were simple. Just trust God, just accept His will, just pray with confidence. But the truth is, my own mother died of Alzheimer's despite 5 years of daily prayers for her healing. And I've never been able to reconcile God's silence during her deterioration with what I teach about answered prayer. Thank you for giving me permission to stop pretending." That conversation revealed something important. It's not just grieving parents or suffering individuals who struggle with God's silence. It's everyone: priests, theologians, bishops, saints. The difference is that most people hide that struggle behind theological language and spiritual platitudes. Carlo's mission for me, the mission he revealed on December 12th, isn't to make people more comfortable with easy faith. It's to make them more honest about difficult faith. It's to create space for people to say, "I prayed and God didn't answer," without being told they didn't have enough faith or didn't pray correctly. Last week, on March 8th, 2025, I returned to Barcelona, the city where my facade finally cracked. The same conference organizers invited me back, asking if I would speak again about suffering and hope. This time, though, the title of my talk was "Learning to Love the God Who Stays Silent." I stood before many of the same 800 people who had heard me 3 months earlier, and I told them everything. The whole truth about divine silence, about the wound I'd carried for 17 years, about Carlo's visit and his explanation, about the 3 months since then when I'd stopped pretending and started being real. Marta Rodriguez was there, sitting in the front row. When I finished speaking, she stood and shared her own testimony about losing her son Pablo, about the 6 months of unanswered prayers, about how my honesty had given her permission to be angry at God while still loving him. I don't understand why God was silent, Marta said. I may never understand in this life, but I've learned that I don't need to understand to keep trusting. I don't need to feel God's presence to believe he's there. And I don't need my prayers answered the way I want them answered to believe that he hears me. That's the paradox Carlo taught me. God's silence is often the loudest expression of his trust in us. He stays silent, not because he doesn't care, but because he believes we're strong enough to develop faith that doesn't depend on feeling his presence. It still hurts. Even now, 3 months after Carlo's visit, when I think about those 90 days in 2006 when God seemed to have abandoned me, I feel the ache of that perceived rejection. But now I understand it differently. Now I see it as the painful but necessary forging of the person I needed to become. Carlo once told me in that last conversation before he died, "Mama, during these 17 years, you'll live each day twice. Once here on earth divulging my story, and once in heaven with me, because each person you help will be like we've met again." He was right. But he left out one detail. Living each day twice means experiencing the pain twice too. Every time I sit with a grieving parent, I relive my own grief. Every time I hear about God's silence in someone's suffering, I remember my own 90 days of unanswered prayers. But that's okay, because now I know the pain has purpose. Now I understand that my wound, instead of being something to hide, is the very thing that makes me useful to other wounded people. Today I carry two truths simultaneously. God loves us deeply, and God sometimes stays silent during our greatest suffering. Both are true. Both must be held together even though they create an uncomfortable tension. That's the message Carlo sent me to share. Not comfortable theology, but honest theology. Not easy faith, but real faith. Not pretend confidence, but authentic struggle that somehow produces deeper trust. And if this channel has been an answer for you, consider leaving a super thanks. This financial help, however small it may seem, sustains this mission and allows us to continue bringing deep and transformative content to more lives that need this word. The ministry of the Dark Night continues to grow. We now have support groups in 30 countries, all facilitated by people who've experienced divine silence and emerged with a deeper, more authentic faith. We're not offering quick fixes or prosperity promises. We're offering what Carlo called honest companionship through darkness. Some people still criticize me. They say I'm undermining faith, promoting doubt, causing scandal. Maybe they're right to be concerned. After all, I'm the mother of Blessed Carlo Acutis, and I'm publicly admitting that God was silent when I needed him most. But I remember what Carlo told me. The people who really need your message, the people drowning in God's silence right now, they will understand. They will finally feel seen and heard by someone who's been where they are. And those people, the ones drowning in silence, desperately needing permission to admit their struggle, they keep writing to tell me that the truth has set them free. Not free from suffering, but free from the burden of pretending that faith is easy. That's the gift of divine silence I've learned. It strips away all pretense. It forces us to develop faith that doesn't depend on good feelings or answered prayers or theological certainty. It forges us in fire until we emerge stronger, more honest, more capable of holding others' pain. Carlo knew this. That's why he orchestrated everything. His death at 15, my 17 years of ministry built on partial truth. The question from Marta Rodriguez that cracked my facade. The visit on December 12th that explained everything. He was teaching me what he'd tried to teach me all along, that God's presence isn't measured by how often we feel him, but by what we become through the times we don't feel him. Thank you, Carlo, for the 90 days of silence that broke me. Thank you for the 17 years of carrying that wound. Thank you for the visit that explained it all. And thank you for showing me that sometimes the greatest gift God can give us is the apparent withdrawal of his presence, because that's when real faith, raw, desperate, unshakable faith is born. Until we meet again, Tesoro. Until we meet again. With love forged in silence, Antonia Salzano, mother of Blessed Carlo Acutis,